Corinne was scrolling through her banking app on a Tuesday evening, checking the automatic transfer that had gone out that morning the way she'd checked it every month for the past 14 months, when she saw her sister's post at the top of her social media feed instead. Day one of being completely debt-free, Faye had written, above a photo of herself standing in her kitchen, holding a handwritten sign that read $40,000, paid in full, no help from anyone but hard work and discipline. The caption went on for several more lines about budgeting spreadsheets and cutting out lattes and saying no to vacations for over a year, about finally proving to herself that she could dig out of a hole entirely on her own strength. Corinne read it twice, sitting on her couch with her phone in one hand and a glass of water going warm on the coffee table in front of her. There were already 60-some comments underneath, family members and old college friends and coworkers, all of them some version of proud of you, or you did the hard work, girl, or knew you had it in you. Nobody in any of those comments mentioned Corinne, which made a certain kind of sense, since Faye hadn't mentioned Corinne either, not in the caption, not in any comment she'd left responding to well-wishers, not anywhere in the 60-some replies Corinne scrolled through slowly, half expecting to find her own name somewhere, half already knowing she wouldn't. Corinne set the phone down on the coffee table, picked up her glass of water, and sat with it for a while, not entirely sure what she was feeling yet, though something in her chest had gone tight and unfamiliar in a way she recognized, distantly, as the beginning of an anger she hadn't fully decided to let herself feel just yet. Her phone buzzed again 20 minutes later, a text from her mother in the family group chat, a chat Corinne had muted months earlier but still occasionally checked out of habit, thinking it might be easier if it's just a smaller group at Thanksgiving this year, her mother had written, given how tight things are for some of us. Faye and Roland are hosting, and I think they want to keep it manageable. We can all get together for a smaller lunch another time, honey, once things settle down for you a bit. Corinne read the message 3 times before she understood, fully, what it was actually telling her. She wasn't being asked to skip Thanksgiving because the guest list had gotten too large. She was being quietly, gently excused from it because her family believed she couldn't afford to contribute, couldn't afford the trip, couldn't afford in some vague, unspoken way to be there at all. She looked back at the banking app still open on her other screen, at the transfer history stretching back 14 months, each one dated, each one labeled, each one sent directly to a collections account that had, as of that morning's final payment, finally reached a zero balance. $40,000. Her money, her name on every single transfer receipt. She hadn't told anyone in the family what she'd done, not because she wanted credit exactly, but because Faye had asked her not to, back when this whole thing started, and Corinne had respected that request for over a year without complaint. She was starting to understand, sitting there with her family's Thanksgiving excuse still glowing on her phone screen, that respecting the request had come at a cost she hadn't fully anticipated. Corinne and Faye had grown up 2 years apart, in a house where the differences between them had been noticed and commented on for as long as either of them could remember. Faye was the older one, the outgoing one, the one who filled a room the moment she walked into it, the one their mother Sandra had always described, with obvious pride, as a natural leader. Corinne had been the quieter of the two, steady rather than dazzling, the kind of child teachers described as reliable rather than remarkable. A distinction that had followed both sisters well into adulthood in ways neither of them had ever fully discussed out loud. It wasn't that their parents didn't love Corinne. She understood that, even as an adult looking back on the pattern with more clarity than she'd had as a child. But love and attention weren't always distributed evenly, and Faye had always required more of both. Her successes celebrated more loudly, her setbacks treated with more urgency and concern, in a way that had, over the decades, taught Corinne to expect less fanfare for her own steadier, quieter accomplishments. Corinne still remembered, with unusual clarity for something that had happened when she was 11, the year she'd won a regional science fair with a project on water filtration that had taken her nearly 3 months of after-school work to complete. Her parents had come to the awards ceremony, had clapped along with everyone else when her name was called, and had taken her out for ice cream afterward, a modest, pleasant celebration that Corinne remembered fondly. What she remembered more clearly, though, was the drive home, during which her mother had spent most of the ride describing, in far more animated detail, the middle school play Faye had a minor role in that same week. Wondering aloud whether Faye had what it took to pursue theater seriously one day. Corinne's science fair ribbon had sat in her lap the entire drive, mentioned only once more before they reached the house. She hadn't resented Faye for any of it, not as a child, and not really as an adult either. Faye hadn't asked to be the one who filled up more space in every room. It was simply how she'd always been, and their parents had simply always responded to it. But the pattern had left its mark regardless, teaching Corinne early that her own achievements needed to be quieter, more self-contained, satisfying to her mostly on their own terms rather than through the validation of an audience that had learned to look elsewhere first. Corinne had built a career as a physical therapist, stable and well-regarded but never flashy, working at the same clinic for 9 years, living within her means in a modest 2-bedroom house she'd bought on her own at 31. Faye had bounced between several different jobs and 2 different business ventures, both of which had failed within their first 2 years, financed largely through credit cards and a series of loans that had, by the time Faye finally admitted the scope of it, ballooned into just over $40,000 of high-interest debt spread across 4 different accounts. Faye had broken down about it at Corinne's kitchen table, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon that Corinne remembered with unusual clarity, given how rarely her sister let herself appear anything other than composed and entirely in control. Faye had shown up unannounced, tears already streaming by the time Corinne opened the door, and had spent the next 2 hours describing, in halting, humiliated fragments, the collection calls that had started coming multiple times a day, the letters she'd stopped opening, the fact that she and Roland had started fighting almost weekly about money in a way that felt to Faye like it might genuinely threaten the marriage. "I don't know what to do," Faye had said, wiping her face with the sleeve of her sweater. "I've tried everything. I can't ask Mom and Dad. They don't have this kind of money, and even if they did, I can't stand the thought of them knowing how badly I messed this up." Corinne had listened, mostly quiet, turning the numbers over carefully in her head as Faye talked, doing the kind of careful mental math she'd always been good at, the kind that had once made her the reliable one rather than the remarkable one. She had savings, more than most people her age, built slowly and carefully over 9 full long years of steady work and modest living. She hadn't been planning to spend it on anything in particular at all. It had simply been sitting there quietly, growing, a quiet form of security she'd never actually had to test before now. And some part of her, listening to her sister's voice break apart across the kitchen table, understood that this might finally be the moment that quiet security had actually been meant for all along. "I can help," Corinne had said, before she'd fully finished thinking through what that would mean. "Not as a loan. I don't want you paying me back and feeling like you owe me forever. I'll just take care of it." She'd surprised herself a little, saying it, though not as much as she probably should have. Some part of her had been waiting, for years, for a moment where she could be the one who fixed something, who mattered in a way that didn't require anyone to first notice her, and Faye's crisis, as painful as it clearly was, had handed her exactly that kind of opportunity, almost without her realizing it. She thought, briefly, about what $40,000 actually represented in her own life. The years of steady saving, the vacations she hadn't taken, the newer car she'd kept putting off buying because the old one still ran fine. None of that felt like sacrifice in the moment. It felt, instead, like the first time in a long while that her quiet discipline had a purpose bigger than her own modest comfort, a chance to matter in a way that didn't depend on someone else noticing first. Faye had cried harder at that, gratitude this time instead of shame, and had asked Corinne almost immediately not to tell anyone in the family. "I can't have Mom and Dad know I needed this kind of help," Faye had said. "Let me tell them I fixed it myself, once it's done, please. I need this one thing to be mine." Corinne had agreed, at the time, without much hesitation, because she understood, better than most, how much her sister's sense of self depended on being seen as capable, and because she genuinely hadn't wanted the help to come with strings or credit attached. She'd only made one condition of her own. She wanted everything documented, every transfer, every payment, clearly labeled and dated, kept in a folder on her own computer that no one else had access to. Not because she distrusted Faye exactly, but because some careful, self-protective part of her had learned, over many years of being the quieter sister, that documentation was the only kind of proof that never depended on someone else's memory or goodwill. The payments had gone out monthly for 14 months, directly to each of the 4 collection accounts, chipping away steadily at the balance, the way Corinne had always chipped away at anything worth doing carefully. She never mentioned it to anyone else in the family, kept her own spending modest during those months to make sure the payments never strained her own finances, and watched, from a certain quiet distance, as Faye's stress visibly eased over the course of that year, the fights with Roland softening, the version of her sister that showed up to family gatherings growing lighter and more like herself again. Corinne told herself, during those months, that this was enough, that watching her sister's life improve was its own kind of reward, one that didn't require acknowledgement to be meaningful. Mostly she believed that. There were moments, though, small ones, that tested the theory more than she expected. A family dinner where Faye mentioned offhand that she and Roland were finally getting their finances under control, and their mother had praised her at length for finally growing up and taking responsibility, while Corinne sat across the table saying nothing, holding the actual mechanism of that responsibility quietly in her own bank account. The pattern of being quietly overlooked didn't start with the debt payoff, though it deepened considerably during those 14 months. Corinne could trace it back through years of smaller moments, the kind that were easy to dismiss individually and much harder to dismiss once she started adding them together. There had been the family reunion 2 years earlier, where Faye had organized the entire event and received a round of applause from their extended family for her effort, while Corinne, who had quietly paid for half the venue deposit after Faye's card had been declined at the booking, was never mentioned once. There had been the birthday dinner the year before that, where their mother had spent 20 minutes describing Faye's promotion at a job Faye would leave within the year, and had asked Corinne, almost as an afterthought, how work was going, before the conversation moved on, before Corinne had finished her second sentence of an answer. She thought, sometimes, about the venue deposit specifically, the way she'd quietly transferred $300 to Faye's account the night before the reunion, after Faye called in a small panic explaining that the booking site had rejected her card and the reservation would be canceled within the hour if nobody paid the remaining balance right away. Corinne had sent the money without hesitation, had never mentioned it again, and had watched, 2 weeks later, as their mother thanked Faye at length in front of the whole extended family for putting together such a wonderful event, entirely on her own initiative. It hadn't occurred to Corinne in that moment to correct the record. It had only occurred to her, much later looking back, how many of these small corrections she'd quietly declined to make over the years, each one small enough to seem petty to raise on its own. None of it had felt significant enough, on its own, to raise as a grievance. Corinne had absorbed each moment the way she absorbed most things, quietly, without complaint, telling herself that she wasn't the kind of person who needed constant validation the way her sister seemed to, that being steady and reliable was its own reward even if it rarely earned the same enthusiasm Faye's more visible struggles and triumphs did, and that someday, somehow, the balance would even itself back out. The second sign that something in the family's accounting of her had shifted, beyond simple oversight, came about 8 months into the secret debt payments, At a dinner where Faye mentioned, in passing, that she and Roland had decided to scale back the guest list for an upcoming anniversary party, keeping things smaller and more intimate given how expensive hosting had gotten. Corinne hadn't thought much of the comment at the time. She found out 3 weeks later, through a cousin who mentioned it without any awareness that Corinne hadn't been informed, that the anniversary party had happened, with nearly 40 guests in attendance, everyone in the extended family except Corinne. When she'd asked her mother about it, carefully, her mother had seemed genuinely surprised Corinne hadn't been invited, had said she assumed Faye had included her, and had promised to ask about it, though nothing ever came of that promise, and Corinne had eventually let the question drop rather than push it into an actual confrontation. The third sign came 6 weeks before the Thanksgiving text, when Corinne overheard, entirely by accident, a conversation between her mother and an aunt during a phone call Corinne had picked up moments too early, catching a fragment of dialogue before either woman realized she was on the line. "I just worry about her sometimes," her mother had been saying, in the particular tone she used when discussing someone she considered a source of quiet concern. "She works so hard and never seems to get ahead the way Faye has, even with everything Faye's been through this year. I don't know if it's the job or just bad luck, but it does seem like Corinne's always struggling a little more than the rest of us realize." Corinne had hung up quickly, before either woman noticed she'd been listening, and had sat with the conversation for a long time afterward, turning over the strange, quiet injustice of being pitied by her own mother for financial struggles that didn't actually exist, while the sister whose struggles had been very real and very expensive was simultaneously being celebrated for solving them entirely on her own. A similar comment reached her a few weeks earlier than that, though it hadn't fully registered as part of the same pattern until much later. Corinne's cousin Louise had mentioned, at a family barbecue, that she'd been meaning to send Corinne some information about a local financial counseling service she'd found helpful, in case it might be useful for her too, given everything. Given everything? Corinne had asked, more confused than offended in the moment. Louise had looked faintly embarrassed, backpedaling slightly. "I just heard things have been tight for you lately. I didn't mean anything by it. I just thought it might help." Corinne had thanked her, taken the information out of politeness, and spent the rest of the barbecue turning over where, exactly, that impression had come from, since nothing in her actual financial life had changed in any way that would have been visible to anyone outside her own bank statements. She hadn't pushed the question further that day, assuming it was some minor miscommunication that would sort itself out. It wouldn't be until months later, sitting on her couch reading Faye's debt-free post, that she understood how thoroughly that impression had actually spread, and how little anyone had bothered to check whether it was true before repeating it to each other. The debt-free post came 4 days after that overheard phone call, and the Thanksgiving text came 2 days after the post, and by the time Corinne sat on her couch that Tuesday evening scrolling through both, she had already, without quite realizing it, begun assembling the case she would eventually need to make. Corinne didn't respond to her mother's text right away. She sat with it for 2 full days, turning over several different versions of what she might say, before finally deciding that the version that mattered least was the one aimed at her mother, and the version that mattered most was the one aimed at the entire family at once, delivered in a way that would leave no room for the story to be reshaped afterward into something more comfortable for everyone involved. She opened the folder on her computer where she'd kept every transfer record for the past 14 months, organized by date, each one clearly labeled with the collection account it had gone to, and the balance remaining after each payment. She spent an evening putting together a simple summary document, dates, amounts, running totals, nothing embellished, nothing accusatory in tone, just the plain, undeniable arithmetic of exactly what had happened over the past 14 months and who had actually paid for it. She sent it to the family group chat on a Sunday afternoon, along with a short message of her own. "I wanted to share this because I think there's been a misunderstanding about my finances that's affected some decisions this family has made about me recently, including Thanksgiving. Attached is a record of the payments I made over the last 14 months toward Faye's debt, at her request and with her knowledge, which she asked me to keep private until it was paid off. It's paid off now, as of 2 weeks ago. I'm sharing this not to take anything away from how hard Faye worked to get her spending under control, which I know was real and difficult. I'm sharing it because I'd like the family to have an accurate picture of where I actually stand financially, since apparently the current picture has led some people to believe I can't afford to show up for a holiday. The group chat went quiet for nearly an hour after Corinne sent the message, the kind of silence that felt, even through a phone screen, like an entire family collectively rereading something several times before anyone dared respond. Her father, Walter, was the first to actually type anything into the chat itself, a short message that read simply, "This changes things, I need to make some calls," followed a moment later by a second message directed specifically at Corinne. "I'm proud of you for doing this quietly, and I'm sorry none of us noticed sooner." Corinne read both messages twice, surprised at how much they affected her, given how rarely her father weighed in on anything emotional in writing, preferring, usually, to let her mother handle that side of family communication entirely. She saved a screenshot of his message to her phone, something she rarely did, and looked at it again more than once over the following weeks, whenever the rest of the family's slower, more complicated reckoning started to feel like more than she wanted to keep carrying alone. A small, steady reminder that at least one person in the family had understood, immediately and without hesitation, exactly what her silence had actually cost her. Her mother responded next, a short message asking Corinne to call her, which Corinne did, 20 minutes later, sitting on her back porch with the evening starting to cool around her. "Is this true?" her mother asked, her voice carrying an unfamiliar unsteadiness. "All of it?" "Every transfer is dated and labeled," Corinne said. "You can see it yourself. I'm not exaggerating anything." "Why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us believe Faye did this all on her own, and let us think you were the one struggling? Because Faye asked me not to," Corinne said. "And I respected that, for over a year, because I understood why it mattered to her to be seen as capable. What I didn't understand, until a few days ago, was that respecting her privacy would end up costing me an invitation to Thanksgiving, because everyone had quietly decided I was too broke to be worth including." Her mother was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't mean it that way. I was just trying to keep things smaller, less stressful for everyone." "You specifically said it was because things are tight for me," Corinne said. "That wasn't a small detail. That was the reason you gave. And it wasn't true, and it hasn't been true for a long time. And I think part of the reason nobody checked whether it was true is because it's easier to believe I'm the one who's struggling than to notice all the ways I've actually been holding things together." Her mother was quiet again, and when she spoke this time, her voice had softened into something closer to genuine reflection than defense. "I think I've always assumed Faye needed more looking after. She's always seemed like she was one bad month away from everything falling apart, and you've always seemed like you had it handled, so I suppose I stopped really checking on either assumption. I didn't realize how much that had turned into an actual story about you that wasn't true." "That's exactly it," Corinne said. "I had it handled, which meant nobody ever needed to ask whether I still did, even when the reason I had less in my own savings account was that I was quietly handling something for someone else." "I'm sorry," her mother said, and Corinne could hear that she meant it, though she also understood that an apology delivered in a single phone call wasn't going to undo years of a pattern that had shaped how the whole family related to both sisters. "I don't know how to fix 20 years of paying more attention to Faye without it sounding like I'm choosing sides now instead." "You don't have to choose sides," Corinne said. "I just need you to see me accurately. That's all I was actually asking for." Faye called an hour after that, her voice tight in a way that suggested she'd already had a difficult conversation with their mother before reaching out to Corinne directly. You didn't have to post it to the whole family, Faye said, skipping past any greeting entirely. You could have just told me you were upset about Thanksgiving. This is humiliating. I did tell you, in a way, Corinne said. I told the family the truth, because the family had started making decisions about me based on a lie you asked me to help you tell. I kept your secret for 14 months, Faye. I never once complained that you didn't mention me in your post, even though it stung more than I expected it to. But I'm not going to keep being quietly excluded from things because everyone believes I'm broke, when the actual reason I have less to show for myself financially right now is that I spent the last year paying off your debt. Faye didn't have an immediate answer for that. Corinne could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, could picture, with unusual clarity, the exact expression her sister's face was probably making, the one she made whenever a version of events she'd carefully constructed started coming apart faster than she could manage it. I was going to tell people eventually, Faye said finally, though her voice had lost most of its earlier certainty. I just wanted a little time to feel like it was really mine first. I understand wanting that, Corinne said. I gave you 14 months of that, without asking for anything in return. What I didn't understand was that giving you that would somehow turn into me being the one nobody trusted to show up for a holiday. I'll fix it, Faye said. I'll tell everyone the truth. I'll take the post down, whatever you need. You don't need to take the post down, Corinne said. I don't need your celebration erased. You did work hard, cutting the spending, changing your habits, showing up differently in your marriage because of it. That part was real, and it was yours. I just need people to stop treating me like the family charity case, because you left one detail out of the story. Faye was quiet for a moment. I didn't think about it that way. I just wanted one thing that felt like mine. I know, Corinne said, and found, saying it, that she meant it, even through the residual hurt still sitting in her chest. I just needed one thing that felt like mine too, and apparently the only way I was going to get it was to make sure everyone saw the receipts. Thanksgiving happened 3 weeks later, and Corinne went, invited properly this time, by her mother directly rather than through Faye's household. The dinner itself was quieter than usual. A careful, slightly stilted kind of politeness settled over the table that hadn't been there in previous years, though Corinne found she didn't mind it as much as she might have expected to. It felt, if nothing else, more honest than the alternative. A family finally reckoning, in small, uncomfortable increments, with a pattern they'd never had reason to examine closely before. Her aunt, the same one whose phone call Corinne had accidentally overheard, pulled her aside briefly near the dessert table and apologized, awkwardly but sincerely, for the assumptions that conversation had reflected. I should have asked you directly, instead of just talking around it with your mother, she said. I think I just repeated something I'd heard secondhand without really checking it myself. That was thoughtless of me. Corinne accepted the apology, appreciating it more than she let on, and found herself thinking, not for the first time that day, about how many of the family's assumptions about her had traveled exactly that way, second-hand, unverified, repeated until they hardened into something that felt true, simply because enough people had said it to each other. Faye didn't apologize directly that day, not in front of everyone, though she did pull Corinne aside briefly in the kitchen while their mother carved the turkey, and said, quietly, that she was sorry, that she hadn't fully understood how much the silence had cost Corinne until she'd had a few weeks to sit with it. Corinne accepted the apology without pretending it fixed everything, because she had learned over the previous month that some things took longer than a single conversation to actually repair. Roland, Faye's husband, found a quieter moment later that same afternoon to speak with Corinne alone, while the two of them were loading leftovers into containers in the kitchen. He'd been mostly silent through the earlier tension, the way he usually was during family conflict, but he set down the container he was holding and looked at Corinne directly. I want you to know I always knew, he said. Faye told me the truth about where the money came from the same week it happened. I've felt strange about it for over a year, watching everyone treat her like she'd done it alone, watching you get quietly left out of things because people thought you were struggling. I should have said something sooner. I didn't want to break her trust, but I also should have found a way to make sure you weren't the one paying for her secret in more ways than one. Corinne appreciated the honesty, though it also confirmed something she'd already begun to suspect, that the family's misunderstanding of her finances hadn't simply been an accident of miscommunication. It had been in part a story that more than one person had quietly known the truth about and chosen not to correct, because correcting it would have complicated a narrative everyone found easier and more comfortable to live with. The months that followed brought small, incremental changes rather than any single dramatic transformation. Her mother started checking in with Corinne more regularly, asking real questions about her work and her life, rather than the brief, distracted inquiries that had become habitual over the years. Faye, for her part, began crediting Corinne publicly, in small ways, mentioning her sister's help whenever the topic of her debt came up among friends or family. A correction that felt, to Corinne, less like restitution and more like the ordinary acknowledgement that should have existed from the beginning. Corinne kept the folder of transfer records on her computer, though she never needed to reference it again after that Sunday afternoon. She thought about it sometimes anyway, the quiet discipline of documenting something she'd never expected to need proof of, the strange foresight of a habit built out of years spent being the reliable one, the overlooked one, the sister whose contributions rarely made it into anyone else's version of the story unless she made sure, carefully and deliberately, that they did. She started, in the year that followed, doing something she'd never really allowed herself before, mentioning her own accomplishments out loud without waiting for someone else to notice them first. A promotion at the clinic, a half marathon she finished, a small kitchen renovation she'd saved up for and finally completed. None of it was dramatic, but she found, each time, that naming her own life a little more loudly than she used to felt less like bragging than it once might have, and more like something closer to simple accuracy. The same accuracy she'd fought so hard to establish that Sunday afternoon when she'd finally decided that 14 months of silence had cost her enough. If you've ever quietly carried the weight of something and watched someone else take the credit for it, at what point does staying silent stop being generosity and start being a decision that costs you more than you're willing to keep paying? And if the truth only came out because you finally decided to show your receipts, would you have waited as long as Corinne did, or would you have spoken up the very first time you noticed no one was giving you credit for what you'd actually done?